On the morning of May 10th, 1996, hundreds of climbers around the world were focused on one place, Mount Everest. At 29,032 feet, Everest stood as the tallest mountain on Earth, a frozen giant that had inspired adventurers for generations. Reaching its summit was considered one of the greatest achievements a person could accomplish. But on that day, Everest would become the scene of one of the deadliest disasters in mountaineering history. Among the climbers struggling toward the summit was a quiet, determined American named Doug Hansen. He wasn't a famous athlete. He wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't a professional climber. He was simply a mailman from Washington State who had spent years chasing a dream that seemed impossible. And that dream would ultimately cost him his life. This is the story of Doug Hansen, the ordinary man who refused to give up on Everest. Doug Hansen was born and raised in the United States. Unlike many famous climbers who came from wealthy families or elite mountaineering backgrounds, Doug lived a simple life. Friends described him as hardworking, friendly, and incredibly determined. He worked as a postal worker, delivering mail and living the life of an average American. But deep inside, Doug carried a passion that few people understood. He loved mountains. He loved adventure. He loved testing himself against nature. Whenever he had free time, he could often be found hiking or climbing. The mountains gave him something that ordinary life couldn't provide, a sense of freedom. Over the years, he became increasingly fascinated with Mount Everest. For climbers, Everest is more than a mountain. It is an obsession, a challenge, a dream. And Doug wanted to stand on its summit more than anything. The problem was that climbing Everest was incredibly expensive. Even in the 1990s, an expedition could cost tens of thousands of dollars. For a mailman, that was a huge amount of money. But Doug refused to let financial challenges stop him. He worked hard. He saved money. He sacrificed comforts. And slowly, year after year, he moved closer to his goal. In 1995, Doug got his chance. He joined a commercial expedition led by famous New Zealand climber and guide Rob Hall. Hall was one of the most respected guides in the world. His company, Adventure Consultants, had an outstanding safety record. Clients paid large sums of money to climb Everest under his leadership. Doug was one of those clients. The expedition climbed higher and higher through the dangerous Khumbu icefall across the western Khum and toward the South Kernel. Doug pushed himself harder than ever before. But tragedy struck before he could reach the summit. Because of time limits and safety concerns, he was forced to turn around only a short distance below the top. Imagine climbing for weeks, spending thousands of dollars, risking your life, and then stopping within sight of your dream. Doug was devastated. Many climbers would have accepted defeat and moved on. Doug could not. He returned home, determined to try again. His friends later recalled how badly he wanted another chance. He had come so close, too close to quit. In 1996, Doug returned. Again, he joined Rob Hall's expedition. Again, he invested enormous amounts of money and effort. This would be his second opportunity, his second chance at glory. Throughout the expedition, Doug showed the same determination that had defined him for years. But there were warning signs. Some climbers noticed that Doug was slower than others. The higher they climbed, the harder he had to work. At extreme altitude, every step feels exhausting. The air contains only a fraction of the oxygen available at sea level. Simple tasks become difficult. Thinking becomes harder. Decision-making slows. Even experienced climbers can struggle. Still, Doug kept going. The summit was finally within reach, and he wasn't willing to give up again. On the night of May 9th, 1996, climbers began their final push toward the summit. The weather appeared manageable. Headlamps illuminated a long line of climbers moving upward through the darkness. The plan was simple. Reach the summit. Turn around by a predetermined time. Descend safely. On Everest, turnaround times are critical. Many climbers die not while going up, but while coming down. Most accidents happen because climbers spend too much time near the summit and run out of daylight, oxygen, energy, or luck. Rob Hall had established a strict turnaround time. Anyone who hadn't reached the summit by that time was supposed to descend. No exceptions. But as the day progressed, delays began to develop. Traffic jams formed on the mountain. Fixed ropes were not in place where they were supposed to be. Climbers waited. Hours passed. Schedules slipped. Doug struggled to keep pace. By afternoon, he still had not reached the summit. The safe decision would have been to turn around. But this wasn't just another climb for Doug. This was the dream he had spent years chasing. The dream he had nearly achieved the year before. Rob Hall knew how much reaching the summit meant to him. And so Hall made a decision that would become one of the most controversial moments in Everest history. He continued upward with Doug. Eventually, late in the day, Doug Hansen stood on top of Mount Everest. For a brief moment, he had done it. The mailman for Washington had reached the highest point on Earth. The dream was complete, but the celebration would be tragically short. As climbers began descending, the weather suddenly changed. A powerful storm moved across Everest. Winds intensified. Visibility disappeared. Temperatures plummeted. The mountain transformed into a frozen nightmare. Climbers became disoriented. Many could no longer see the route. Others were running dangerously low on oxygen. Exhaustion overwhelmed everyone. Doug was especially vulnerable. He had spent too much energy reaching the summit. Now he faced the most difficult part of the climb, the descent. Descending Everest requires concentration and strength. One mistake can be fatal. As conditions deteriorated, Doug began struggling badly. Rob Hall stayed with him. The guide refused to abandon his client. Together, they fought against the storm. But the mountain was winning. As darkness fell, communications over radio became increasingly desperate. Climbers reported people missing. Others were trapped. Several were collapsing from exhaustion. High on the mountain, Rob Hall remained with Doug Hansen. According to later accounts, Doug could no longer continue effectively. He was exhausted beyond recovery. The altitude, cold, and fatigue had pushed his body to its limits. At nearly 29,000 feet, rescue is almost impossible. There are no helicopters, no emergency vehicles, no quick solutions. Every climber is largely responsible for their own survival. At some point during the night, Doug Hansen disappeared into the storm. He was never seen alive again. The exact details of his final moments remain uncertain. What is known is heartbreaking. A man who spent years pursuing his dream had reached the summit, only to lose his life during the descent. Rob Hall also became trapped on the mountain. Despite radio contact and rescue efforts, Hall died there as well. The storm claimed multiple lives and became one of the most famous disasters in Everest history. The 1996 Everest Disaster shocked the world. Books, documentaries, and films would later tell the story. Perhaps the most famous account came from journalist and climber John Krakauer, whose book Into Thin Air introduced millions of readers to the tragedy. Years later, the disaster was dramatized in the movie Everest. Among all the guides, experts, and elite climbers involved, Doug Hansen remains one of the most memorable figures. Why? Because he represented something deeply human. He wasn't climbing Everest for fame. He wasn't seeking sponsorships. He wasn't trying to break records. He was chasing a personal dream, a dream that required years of sacrifice, determination, and courage. Some critics argue that Doug should have turned around earlier. Others believe the guides should have enforced stricter limits. Those debates continue today, but one fact remains unchanged. Doug Hansen never quit. He came within reach of Everest once and returned for another chance. Many people spend their entire lives wondering, what if? Doug refused to live with that question. He went back. He reached the summit. And although he never came home, he achieved what he had spent years striving for. His story serves as both inspiration and warning. It reminds us that determination can accomplish extraordinary things. But it also reminds us that nature has limits that even the strongest human cannot overcome. Today, somewhere high on the slopes of Mount Everest, beneath ice, snow, and endless wind, rests the final chapter of Doug Hansen's journey. A mailman, a dreamer, an adventurer, a man who reached the roof of the world and paid the ultimate price for it.